Lieutenant Marcus Hale thought the sea had no secrets left. Beside him, Ensign David Mercer leaned over the railing, staring into the black waters that seemed far too still. Both men had served long enough to know silence at sea was dangerous, but that night it was worse. It was unnatural. When the ship's engines fell quiet without warning, when the crew's voices faded into nothing, the two officers realized they weren't sailing alone. Something else was aboard, something that dragged itself through the shadows of the ship, waiting for them to notice. The ocean has always carried a strange power over me, a pull that never truly loosens its grip. Years in the Navy had hardened me to storms, to sleepless nights, to endless patrols across black waters where nothing stirred but the waves. Yet there are nights when the sea feels different, when the air presses down on you so thick it feels like a weight, and even the stars above abandon their post. That night was one of them. I had taken my watch, as I always did, pacing the deck under a sky that seemed more like a ceiling than an open expanse. The stars were gone, the moon hidden behind a shroud of thick clouds, and the waters below stretched out like a sheet of dark glass. Every sound that usually marked life on board was gone. No voices drifting from below, no footsteps of the men finishing their shifts, not even the steady hum of the ship's massive engines seemed present anymore. It was as though something had stolen the life from the vessel, leaving me to stand guard on a floating corpse. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself this was just another quiet night, but the silence was unnatural, oppressive. Even the wind, which should have kissed my skin with salt and cold, refused to stir. I walked the length of the deck, my boots tapping softly against the steel, but the sound was muffled, swallowed almost before it left me. The horizon offered nothing, just blackness in every direction, as if the ship had been cut loose from the world and cast into some endless void. I leaned against the railing and squinted, forcing my eyes to adjust to the dark. For a moment I thought I saw something on the waves, shapes, low and slithering, drifting alongside us. I blinked hard, and they were gone, swallowed by the night, leaving me staring at nothing but restless water. A prickle spread across my skin, a sensation I had come to trust during my service. The body knows before the mind does, and mine was telling me something was wrong. The hairs on my arms stood tall, and my chest tightened as though my lungs had shrunk. I checked my watch, trying to steady myself with the routine of it, but the sight made my stomach drop. The hands had stopped moving. Midnight. The second hand was frozen, forever caught between ticks. I shook the watch, tapped it against my wrist, but it remained still. A faulty watch was nothing unusual, but in that moment, it felt like more than coincidence. My shift had dragged on far too long. By now, I should have been relieved, another officer taking my place on deck. Yet no one came. The ship was large, its crew busy, and silence like this was impossible. Even if everyone below was asleep, there should have been the constant mechanical heartbeat of the ship. But here I stood, listening to nothing but the blood rushing in my own ears. That was when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, rising up through the steel beneath my boots. A dragging noise, metallic and uneven, like chains scraping across the hull. I froze, pressing my palms to the railing as if steadying myself against a storm. The sound came again, longer this time, stretching out into the stillness like a scream muffled under water. I leaned over the edge of the deck, my eyes scouring the waves, expecting to see debris, nets, anything that might have caught against the ship. But the sea was bare. A mirror of darkness. The noise hadn't come from outside. It came from within. The realization struck like ice water down my spine. Something was moving below deck. The sound of steel against steel echoed faintly, traveling through the veins of the ship, a hollow rhythm that didn't belong. My throat went dry, and I told myself it must have been cargo shifting, equipment sliding free. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The scrape was too deliberate, too measured, as though something was being dragged slowly, carefully, by unseen hands. I pulled my gaze from the water and looked around the deck again, hoping, praying to see another officer, another sailor, anyone who could explain what I was hearing. But I was alone, utterly alone. The deck stretched wide and empty, the rails gleaming faintly with condensation, the lifeboats hanging still in their cradles. My heart pounded as I walked the length again, searching for a sign of movement, but there was nothing, only that dreadful scrape carrying through the hull like a whisper meant for me alone. The silence pressed harder, so heavy I felt as though I were standing at the bottom of the sea instead of above it. My own footsteps slowed. My breathing grew shallow, ragged. I wanted to call out to break the quiet with my own voice, but I couldn't bring myself to. It was as if the darkness was listening, waiting for me to speak. Something inside warned me that if I made a sound, whatever was dragging itself across the metal below would answer. The scrape came again, louder, closer. And then, just as I forced myself to move toward the stairwell, I realized something else. My watch wasn't just broken. The hands weren't stuck between ticks. They had been moved, bent backward, as if by something pressing down from inside the glass. The stairwell stretched down like a throat swallowing me whole, the dim emergency lights casting pale circles that barely pierced the dark. My boots clanged against the steel rungs, each step echoing far too loudly in the silence. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, thick with the sour tang of rust and something else, salt water, as though the sea had found its way inside the ship. My skin prickled with sweat despite the chill. I could still hear it, the sound that had dragged me from the safety of the deck, that scraping, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was louder now, and with each step down, it grew more deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if it wanted me to follow. When I reached the corridor below, the silence pressed harder. The passage stretched ahead, long and narrow, lined with doors leading into the sleeping quarters. The overhead lights flickered once, buzzing faintly, then steadied into a dim glow. I turned left, drawn by the sound, but my footsteps slowed when I noticed the bunks. Each bed was made perfectly, blankets folded with military precision, pillows lined in neat rows, not a single sign of life. No boots at the foot of the beds, no duffel bags, no photographs pinned to the walls as the crew often left behind. The place looked abandoned, stripped of the men who should have been sleeping soundly at this hour. I stepped closer to one of the bunks, resting my hand against the pillow. It was damp, freezing to the touch, as though it had been pulled from icy water. The smell of salt was stronger here, faint but undeniable. My throat tightened as I pulled my hand away, drops of moisture clinging to my fingertips. How could the beds be wet when no one was here? The dragging sound came again, sharper this time, like metal clawing against metal. I followed, moving deeper through the corridor, my pulse pounding in my ears. I expected at any moment for one of the crew to step out, to laugh, to explain what was happening. But the ship remained still, heavy with absence. I reached the engine room. Normally, the space vibrated with the thunder of machinery, the steady heartbeat of the ship. But when I stepped inside, the silence was absolute. The great engines loomed like corpses, dark and lifeless, their pipes dripping water onto the floor. The puddles shimmered in the faint light, their surfaces disturbed by ripples that spread outward without cause, as though something unseen was stirring beneath them. My chest tightened as I crouched down, my reflection trembling in the water's surface. For a moment, I thought it was only my face staring back at me. But then it blinked. My reflection's eyes shut and opened while mine stayed still, and I staggered back, heart hammering against my ribs. The ripples spread wider as though something beneath the puddle had been disturbed. I couldn't look again. I didn't dare. I turned quickly, scanning the far end of the corridor beyond the engine room. That's when I saw it. A figure stood there, motionless, half hidden in the dim light. A Navy uniform, the kind every officer wore. Relief shot through me, sharp and desperate. I wasn't alone, but the feeling drained in an instant when I noticed the head. It hung low, twisted at an impossible angle, chin resting against the shoulder as though the neck had been snapped backward. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood with its back to me. I blinked, wiping sweat from my eyes, and in that single moment it was gone. The corridor stood empty, only shadows shifting with the flicker of the lights. I told myself I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks, that long watches and silence could wear down even the strongest men. But as I stood there, frozen, I realized the puddle at my feet had begun to ripple again. Not gently this time, but violently, as though something were clawing its way upward through the steel floor. The scraping sound returned, dragging along the hull louder than before. It echoed all around me, filling the corridor with a grinding metallic scream. I pressed my back against the wall, my chest heaving. The ship was alive with it now, every surface vibrating with that dreadful pull. And in that moment, with the shadows stretching long and the lights buzzing above me, I knew I wasn't alone in the belly of the ship. Something was down there with me, and it was moving closer. I stumbled back into the corridor, the silence returning almost as suddenly as it had been broken, though it no longer felt like silence at all. It was heavier now, dense and alive, pressing down on me like the weight of the ocean itself. My boots echoed softly as I walked, the sound swallowed into the steel walls before it could fade naturally. Every hallway looked the same, long, narrow, lined with pipes dripping condensation that hissed when the droplets hit the floor. I tried to remember the way back to the stairwell, but no matter which path I chose, the corridors seemed to fold in on themselves, leading me deeper instead of out. The ship felt wrong, as though its shape had changed while I wasn't looking. I turned corner after corner, expecting at any moment to recognize a section I had walked before, but nothing felt familiar. The longer I searched, the stronger the feeling grew that I was being led somewhere, funneled like water through a drain. My breathing quickened, ragged in the still air, and that was when I noticed the walls. Photographs lined the passageways, framed in thin glass, the kind the Navy always hung to commemorate crews of the past. I had walked these corridors countless times, but I had never paid them much attention before. Now they demanded it. I stopped at the first frame I saw, squinting in the dim light. It was a group photo. Dozens of sailors standing shoulder to shoulder, staring into the camera. But their faces weren't right. They weren't blurred in the way old photographs sometimes fade with time. They were smeared, melted almost, like wax figures left too close to a flame. White patches replaced eyes, mouths stretched into grotesque shapes or vanished entirely, leaving smooth hollows where features should have been. I felt my stomach turn as I leaned closer, tracing the outline of one face with my eyes. And then I saw it. My own face, perfectly clear among the ruined blurs, my eyes staring straight out at me from decades-old paper. My chest clenched, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The next photo down the hall caught my attention. Another group of sailors, another collection of twisted, faceless figures. And again, there I was. My face sharp and detailed, unchanged, watching me from the glass as if I had always been there. I ripped one from the wall in a panic, my hands trembling as I brought it close. The paper was wet, dripping onto my fingers as though it had been submerged in the sea only moments before. Salt stung my nose. I dropped it, expecting it to slap against the steel floor, but it never made a sound. Instead, it splashed, dissolving into black water that spread outward like oil, seeping between the cracks of the floor. My stomach lurched as I stumbled backward, my breath coming fast. The black water slid away under the steel, as though it had never been there. My flashlight flickered once, dimming the corridor for only a second, but when it steadied again, the photographs along the wall were gone. Every frame was empty, glass smeared with dripping salt. A sound rose in the distance, faint but sharp. Not the dragging scrape I had heard before, but something thinner, softer, like a whisper traveling down the length of the ship. I froze, straining to hear, the blood in my ears pounding too loudly. The whisper grew louder, not coming from any one direction, but from everywhere at once, carried by the walls, the ceiling, the steel beneath my boots. The words were impossible to make out, broken by static and echo, but they crawled into me all the same, worming into my mind. I felt dizzy, as though I had stood too quickly, and the corridor swayed beneath my feet. The whispers sharpened, still unintelligible but desperate, urgent. My throat tightened as though someone had pressed cold hands around it. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't outside. They were inside, echoing against the walls of my skull, forcing their way deeper. I squeezed my eyes shut, tried to fight them off, but then came the worst moment of all. I understood one of them, just a fragment, clear and undeniable. It was my own voice, speaking my own thoughts, twisted back at me, repeated like a mocking echo. I gasped, stumbling forward blindly, desperate to escape the sound. My flashlight bobbed across the walls, the light cutting shadows that bent and writhed like living things. I forced myself to open my eyes and look around. The corridor was empty, too empty. And then I felt it. A rush of air against the back of my neck, colder than anything I had ever felt before, colder than the deepest ocean. I knew in that instant I wasn't alone. Something was behind me, close enough to breathe. My heart stopped, and though every nerve screamed at me to run, I couldn't move. Slowly, against every instinct I had, I turned. I spun around so quickly my flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered against the steel floor, its beam rolling across the corridor in a jittering arc. My breath came in ragged bursts as I bent to snatch it up, terrified of what the light might reveal. But when the beam steadied, the hallway was empty. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting with every flicker of the bulb, but there was no figure, no intruder. Nothing to explain the icy breath I had felt brushing the back of my neck. I forced myself to move, half walking, half stumbling toward the nearest hatch. My legs felt stiff, every muscle in my body resisting me, as though the ship itself didn't want me to leave. The corridor stretched too long, far longer than it should have been, and every step I took only seemed to carry me deeper. My reflection flashed in the polished steel walls as I passed, but each reflection looked slightly wrong. In one, my eyes were too wide, stretched into dark pits that swallowed my face. In another, my mouth twisted into a grin I hadn't made, teeth sharp and gleaming like broken glass. I tried not to look, but they pulled my gaze again and again, until I felt my sanity fraying with each glance. When I finally pushed through the hatch and began to climb the ladder, I moved faster than I ever had before, my hands slipping on the cold rungs slick with condensation. The higher I climbed, the louder my heartbeat grew, thundering in my ears like cannon fire. At last I shoved open the heavy door to the deck, the hinges groaning as if reluctant to let me through. Cold night air hit me full in the chest. For the first time in what felt like hours, I breathed deeply, greedily, as though I had been suffocating below. Relief washed over me, shaky and thin, but it didn't last long. I straightened and looked out over the rail, and what I saw sent a spike of ice through my veins. The ocean was gone. Where endless waves should have stretched out in every direction, there was only blackness, an empty void that went on forever. The ship floated on nothing, not a ripple, not a reflection, not even the faint glow of a star. The horizon was gone, the sky swallowed whole by a ceiling of darkness that had no depth. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles turned white, the steel biting into my palms, because the only thing beneath me now was emptiness. Then I noticed them. At first, I thought the shapes along the edge of the deck were shadows, tricks of my trembling flashlight beam. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they weren't tricks. They were people, figures, dozens of them, standing shoulder to shoulder along the perimeter of the ship. They wore uniforms, navy blues soaked and sagging as though they had been dredged straight from the ocean floor. Their skin was pale, waxy, their heads bowed low so their faces were hidden. They stood perfectly still, unmoving, but even without seeing their eyes, I knew they were watching me. I felt the weight of their attention pressing against me, heavy and suffocating, more terrifying than the emptiness beyond the rails. I stepped back, slowly, praying the deck wouldn't groan under my boots, but the ship betrayed me. A long, metallic creak cut through the silence like a scream, and in unison the figures raised their heads. My stomach dropped as their faces came into view. Their jaws hung slack, broken, their mouths spilling seawater that dripped steadily onto the steel. Their eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck the light from the air around them. Not one of them blinked, not one of them breathed. Yet every one of them was alive in a way that defied nature. One stepped forward, boots slapping wetly against the deck. His jaw swung open as if unhinged, seawater pouring down his chest in steady streams. Then another moved, and another, until all of them turned toward me in eerie unison. Their movements weren't human. They shifted like marionettes pulled by invisible strings, jerky and wrong. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam cutting across their faces and bouncing off the steel. The whispers returned, louder now, rushing in from every direction at once, a chorus of broken voices rising from the figures. They spoke no language I knew, but the meaning was clear in the way their words burrowed into my chest. They weren't speaking to me. They were calling me. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I could barely move. My legs felt heavy, like weights had been strapped to them, dragging me toward the deck, toward the line of sailors advancing one slow, synchronized step at a time. My back pressed against the control room door, and I felt the cold steel shudder with each of my terrified breaths. The whispers swelled, filling my head until my own thoughts vanished beneath them. The figures reached out, arms stiff, hands dripping brine, fingers stretched like claws. One of them opened his mouth wider than it should have gone, wider than bones should allow, and from the black pit of his throat came a sound not meant for human ears. It was the sound of drowning. The ship itself groaned in reply. I turned and pushed through the control room door with all the strength I had left, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the steel, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness in trembling arcs. The room, once the heart of the ship, was dead. Consoles that should have glowed with blinking lights were dark and rotted, their surfaces covered in barnacles, seaweed, and dripping salt water. Rust clung to every edge, and when I brushed against the nearest panel, flakes crumbled away in my hand like ash. The smell of brine was suffocating, as if the ocean itself had seeped into every inch of the room. I staggered to the radio, a desperate hope clawing inside me. If I could get a signal out, if I could hear a human voice, maybe I could break whatever nightmare had taken hold of me. My fingers fumbled with the dials, turning knobs that resisted as though glued with rust. The static that burst from the speakers wasn't normal. It was wet, gurgling, like bubbles rising from a drowning throat. I pressed the transmitter and spoke, my voice hoarse, begging for anyone to answer. The static broke for only a moment, replaced by something far worse. A voice answered, but it wasn't another ship, nor was it human. It was my own voice, warped and dragged down into a distorted echo, repeating back my plea in a hollow, mocking tone. Each word dripped with malice, stretching longer than I had spoken it, until it sounded less like language and more like a dirge. My stomach twisted, and I dropped the receiver, letting it swing against the panel. The window in front of the control room caught my eye. It was shattered at the edges, streaked with saltwater stains, and through it I could see the deck. They were closer now, the figures that had once been sailors. They pressed against the railings, lined along the steel, their heads tilted upward toward me. Even from this distance, I could see their blackened sockets, the water streaming endlessly from their slack mouths. They didn't blink, didn't move, but I knew they were waiting. My hand went instinctively to the pistol at my side, the last anchor of sanity in my spiraling mind. I pulled it free, my fingers gripping the cold metal, but the weight felt wrong. I glanced down and saw the weapon was corroded, eaten away by rust, the barrel splitting in flakes that fell like dust to the floor. When I tried to lift it, it crumbled entirely in my hand, leaving nothing but fragments of rot. The only weapon I had was gone. The whispers began again. This time they weren't faint. They filled the room, rolling in waves from every corner, so loud I had to press my hands to my ears. They weren't speaking nonsense anymore. I understood them. They were my thoughts, twisted back at me. Every fear, every doubt, every secret regret I had buried deep was dragged to the surface and thrown into the air. My voice, yet not my voice, echoing in layers, accusing me, reminding me of storms past, of men I could not save, of orders I gave that sent sailors to their deaths. I dropped to my knees, my hands clawing at my head as the sound grew unbearable. The room spun around me, tilting as though the ship itself were sinking. The deck groaned outside, and through the broken glass I saw movement. The sailors were climbing now, crawling toward the control room on stiff limbs, seawater spilling from every joint. Their mouths gaped open, wider and wider, until it seemed their jaws would tear free entirely. The whispers reached a fever pitch, all of them speaking with my voice, until I could no longer tell if I was inside my own body. I staggered back from the window, my eyes catching on a reflection in the glass panel. At first, I thought it was just me, distorted by cracks in the glass. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it became. My reflection's eyes were sunken pits, dark and endless. My skin was pale, colorless, stretched tight over bone. Water dripped from my mouth, running down my chin, soaking the collar of my uniform. I lifted my trembling hand to my face. The reflection lifted its hand too, but slower, deliberate, as though mocking me. A drop of salt water slid down my lip and onto my tongue. It was real. My reflection wasn't a trick of light. It was me. The truth slammed into me with the weight of the sea. I wasn't alive. I hadn't been alive for years. Memories broke through in shards, flashes of a storm, waves crashing over the bow, the ship groaning as it split apart, men screaming, dragged beneath the black water, and me, lungs filling with salt until there was nothing but darkness. The control room door groaned behind me. They were here. My crew, or what was left of them, shuffling closer, arms outstretched, eyes hollow, mouths spilling the same black water that now poured from my own lips. They had been waiting all this time, and now they had come to collect me. I pressed my back against the shattered glass, staring into the void outside the ship. There was no ocean, no sky, no horizon, only black, endless, and eternal. The whispers softened, almost tender now, wrapping around me like a lullaby. My reflection in the window smiled with broken teeth. The last thought that flickered through my mind before the door burst open was not my own. It was theirs. It was the sea's. The sea never lets us go.